In fact, just a little bit less than the county at large. And our goal this year is to have 100% of the congregation vote in this election. There are only 22 days until election day, but really the better way to look at this is we are right in the middle of the beginning of election weeks, because tomorrow starts early in-person voting, which you'll hear more about tonight. Part of the Emanu Votes program is to encourage each of you to make a plan to vote. And so what does that mean, to make a plan to vote? It means that we want each of you to think about how you're going to vote this year. And that means, are you going to vote by mail? Are you going to vote early in person, which we would really encourage for those people who are able and feel comfortable doing so? Or are you going to vote on election day? For those of you that live in Harris County, there are lots of early voting locations that you can vote at. There is a website that we've developed with a lot of information on it. It's at Congregation Emmanuel EE Votes. And there are also links on there to Harris County's website, which has a great deal of information at Harris Votes. For those of you who may be in surrounding counties, we've also posted links to the county clerk in Fort Bend, Brazoria, and Montgomery counties, where you can find election information specific to your situation. But like I said, the important thing is for each of us to vote, and not only for each of us to vote, but to encourage your friends, your family, other congregants to vote as well. It's very important that all of us vote in this election year as we're approaching these election weeks. As I said, early voting does start tomorrow. And there is on the Emanu Votes website a box for those of you who have not taken the pledge to vote. I would really encourage you to go on that site later. We'll have a link to that during the course of this in the chat. And what we want you to do when you take the pledge to vote is really put down in writing what your commitment is in terms of your voting plan. How are you planning on voting? Where are you going to vote? When are you going to vote? And how are you going to get there? And then with your permission, we're going to have members of the volunteer team that's helping out with the Emanu Votes program contact you, follow up with you, and do whatever we can to help you get to the polls this year and exercise your right to vote. So with that, there will be times during the evening you may have questions, put them in the chat. We'll come back with some question and answer time at the end. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Carol Sue.
Okay, Claire?
Claire, please unmute yourself. We've asked you to unmute a few times here.
Hi, I'm Claire Brooks, the other co-president of Sisterhood. Several months ago, we, together with our program committee, decided it would be a good idea to educate our membership on the upcoming election with so many unprecedented issues. So we asked Bob Stein to speak. We realized that coordinating with the poor group's 100% vote effort was a natural. So we contacted them, and luckily, Jason Plotkin, our program director, took over coordinating publicity and reservations, opening the event to the public. So I would like you to meet Bob Stein. Robert M. Stein, PhD, is a Lena Goldman Fox Professor of Political Science at Rice University, faculty director of the Center for Civic Engagement, fellow in urban politics at the Baker Institute, and former dean of the School of Social Science from 1996 to 2006. Professor Stein is an expert on urban politics, public policy, and voting behavior. His current research, funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, Arnold Foundation, and the National Science Foundation, focuses on voting behavior, election administration, and emergency preparedness. He is the author of Urban Alternatives, Private and Public Markets and the Provision of Social Services, for which he received a special award from the Urban Politics and Policy section of the American Political Science Association in 1991. Stein is co-author of Perpetuating the Pork Barrel, Policy, Subsistence, and American Democracy, published in 1995. During his years at Rice, Stein has received numerous awards, including the George R. Brown Award for Superior Teaching in 1998 and 1997. So without further ado, I would like you to meet the very distinguished Bob Stein.
Thank you, Claire. Let me put up my slides. I trust everyone can see them. There's a lot I could cover, and I'll be happy to answer questions. I'll stay on as long as anybody wants to. But the more important issues here today are about the election in 2020. I just completed a survey that is going to be released tomorrow, I think, by some media outlets on Harris County and the problems associated with voting both by mail and in person early in election day. I could talk about, if anyone's interested in the extended debates over mail-in voting, I'd be happy to talk about that. I've got a lot of experience with it. But tonight, what I'd like to do, Claire and I had decided the two big issues were what's at stake. And I guess for lack of any other word, I call it partisan polarization, but how did we get here? So what I'd like to do first is just go through what's at stake, what's going to happen on allegedly on election day, but election day has begun for many Americans over a week ago in Ohio, early voting. Almost 22 million votes have already been cast, and that number will increase dramatically to the point where I believe well over 60, probably close to 70% of all votes will be cast well before the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November 3rd. So what's at stake here? Some of it's obvious, and it changes every minute, and you'll see. I prepared this lecture, I think, about a week ago. Well, we still have a presidential race. We still have 435 House seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. We have 34 Senate seats up, 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats currently make up the Senate. At risk for Republicans, I think there are at least 6 seats: Arizona, Colorado, Maine, Montana, North Carolina, and Iowa. You'll note I didn't put Georgia in there, but some have argued that. At risk for the Democrats, I thought Minnesota and Michigan, they're clearly off the table now. Only the Alabama seat held by Doug Jones in a special election held 2 years ago. And that is certainly going to be going to the Republicans. So the Senate could easily flip hands. I'll talk about estimates and probabilities in a moment. There are still 11 state governors and 33 state legislatures. And you say, well, isn't it enough? Well, those 33 legislatures and 11 state governors in the 2020 election are consequential because, as we all know, we are conducting, as we speak, the U.S. Census. And right after the census is completed every 10 years, we redraw congressional, state legislative, city council, school boards, and every other conceivable district boundaries. And many believe that the drawing of these boundaries, to a large extent, gives one party or the other, whoever is in control of the state house, the governorship, tremendous sway over maintaining legislative dominance at the state and at the congressional level for the next decade. So these are not inconsequential races. Very quickly, if you want to get a picture here, and a picture I think that says more than 1,000 words, what you see is the great interior of America made up of mostly Republicans. Nevertheless, what you're seeing in the interior is not a large number of legislative seats. In states like Montana, North and South Dakota, you don't get many congressional seats, but in states like New York and California, and of course our own state of Texas, Florida, what you're beginning to see is that the blue is emerging as a dominant, the 3 coasts, East and West, and of course our Gulf Coast. It's, let me say here, it's highly unlikely, almost certain. There are many things in this election. The House of Representatives will remain Democratic. Normally in a presidential year, the majority party, the party that's winning, will pick up seats. And I have every expectation, particularly as we'll talk about in Texas, there could be as many as 2 to 3 seats that the Democrats in the state pick up. The GOP is essentially on defense. They started off with 21 seats up for a re-election. Many of those seats, the vast majority of them, are relatively safe, but the Democrats only had 12 to defend. And of those, I think Maine and Colorado, at the time I was putting these slides together, seemed to be the most vulnerable. Collins in Maine, and of course Gardner in Colorado. But to that list has been added Joni Ernest. A complete surprise to me, and I still think he'll hold on, is Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, who's confronting a tremendous challenge there. I think our own Senator Cornyn, who's seen some numbers that have been less than desirable, still is relatively safe. But still, you're going to see some states like Montana. Former Governor Bullock is challenging Daines, the incumbent, and those are seats that could switch. Again, the Democrats, depending on whether or not they win the presidency, need anywhere between 3 and 4. They're certain to lose the Alabama seat. Doug Jones doesn't seem to be likely to hold on to that. So 3 seats plus the vice presidency, with the election of Vice President Biden as president, give them the Senate. I mentioned these electorals, these 11 gubernatorial states, because as you'll see, many of them are red states. And they're states that are not inconsequential, particularly West Virginia, Indiana, and Missouri. These are states where governors control, Republican governors control the state. And if redistricting doesn't work out in the legislature, the governors ultimately make some decisions here. And many of these states, with the exception of North Carolina and Washington, are already solidly red states. So redistricting becomes important, particularly in these states where governors, if the 2 legislative branches of most states, upper and lower house, can't come to an agreement. State houses the same way. The vast majority of state houses now are really in Republican control, and this becomes very important when you're doing legislative redistricting at any level. And again, the fact that there are 33 states up this year gives you an idea that the election is more than just the presidency, the Senate, and the House. Controlling state houses means you can control the boundaries for congressional representation. And the Republicans in 2010 did extremely well, picking up the House and losing it only, of course, in 2008 and again in 2018. Let me give you a quick snapshot of current polling. And what I try to do here is to show you really where Biden and the president are. And for those who think this is a close race, Biden has a big lead in many of these states. And the ones that I would emphasize here are Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I'll talk about Nebraska and Maine in a moment, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and Iowa. These are states, Georgia, Ohio, Iowa, Florida, Arizona, that the president won in 2016. Now, a lot of you are saying, well, Bob, the polls were wrong in 2016. Why would we have any more confidence in them today? And what I try to do here, and what Nate Cohn actually does at the New York Times, is he tries to come back and say, okay, if the polls were wrong as they were in 2012 and in 2016, where's the lead? And again, there are some exceptions. North Carolina, Iowa, Ohio, and Georgia, that's where probably the president's doing a lot better. But in the bulk of the states that we're talking about here that are even in play, and these are probably the exaggerated number of battleground states. My sense is Minnesota probably, and even I would include Florida, are not likely to be battleground, nor is Texas and Georgia. I think Texas, Georgia, and even Florida are clearly in the president's column at this point. And I know that many will argue on that about Biden doing well with elderly voters, but my sense is there the swing will be the Hispanics. But if you just look at this map, or this list, it seems extremely difficult. In fact, those who do the handicapping, like you might bet for the Super Bowl, they don't give the president much more than 0.6 to 0.21. That is 16 to 21% chance of winning. It's about what you get when you're playing poker with an inside straight. Inside straights do happen in poker, and people make a living on that. So take these polls for what they're worth, but I think there's some reason to believe at this point the president's presidential strategy at this point is looking for a very, very narrow win. I will say this, and you can quote me, there is no way on election night the president will win the popular vote. Let me repeat that. This president will be the 3rd president elected in this century without winning the popular vote, should President Trump be reelected. The only way President Trump can be elected is through a very narrow electoral margin of the sort that he fashioned in 2016. there is simply no chance that the popular vote will favor him. I estimate the popular vote will go for Biden between 3.5 million. And if the turnout rates are what we expect there to be, and there's no legal challenges to ballots, particularly mail-in ballots, the president could lose the popular vote between 5 and close to 6 million votes. That would be extraordinary, because until this century, the only time that a presidential candidate was elected without the popular vote was in 1876. So this gives you an idea of how skewed things are. I'll talk a little bit later about the Electoral College, and good or bad, we're with it and not likely to get rid of it anytime soon. If you want to get a sense here of the electoral votes, counting only states where a candidate needs to lead by more than 3, what you're seeing here is that Biden could have a landslide, both in the popular and in the electoral vote. But at this point, my sense is it's a 319 to 219 for the president, and Biden winning. And that's a healthy margin, but not an overwhelming one. The 375 would assume that states like Florida also go to Biden, which I don't think is going to happen. And I think he loses, as I said, Ohio and Georgia, and of course our own state of Texas, all of which are much closer. And if you're asking about Texas, the president won with 9 points in 2016. I don't think he will get above 5%. And my number is somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 point victory in the state, which gives you an idea of what's been happening over time. If we shift to Texas, I want to give you a picture. This is some analysis I've been doing with some voter data. This is based on all registered voters. If you want, I can explain how I come up with these numbers. But in 2019, I estimated that the Republican registered voter pool in the state was 45% Republican, 39% Democratic, with a healthy 16% somewhere in between. And if you look at that point in between, what you see is that it's ever slightly favoring the Republicans. That was the partisan distribution. Now, what I also wanted to ask is, what are the chances of Democrats taking the state house? There's no likelihood they can win the Senate, largely because there's just simply not enough seats up. But in 2010, the Republicans held 100 seats of 150 seats in the Texas State House. Today, the Republicans hold a 9-seat advantage. In every election since 2010, that's 2010, 12, 14, 16, and 18, the Democrats have picked up between 3 and as many as 6 to 8 seats in the State House, leading to the situation in 2020 where they're only 9 seats away. So let's look at the 9 seats, just the distribution of partisan preferences in the swing House seats, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And what you begin to see is the margin gets a lot closer. Where it was probably a 6-point difference, the margin now is no more than about 3 points. And with 19% of independents, again, if you're careful to look at this table, independents favor slightly more Republican candidates than Democratic. Where are these swing districts? They're where you might expect them to be. In the Valley, right here in Harris County, a little bit north of Austin, and most of them in the Dallas-Tarrant County. To give you an idea of how the state has subtly moved, every one of the major urban counties, Dallas, Tarrant, Harris, Bexar, Travis, and El Paso, have become solidly blue Democratic counties. Collin and Williamson counties, suburbs of Dallas, were in 2012 60% to 65% supporters for Romney. In 2018, they barely gave a majority in Williams and Collin County to the top of the ticket, Ted Cruz. Not necessarily the most attractive candidate, but it gives you an idea of how urban Texas, metro Texas, suburban Texas has been steadily moving away from the Republican Party. Again, I'll talk about that later if you want, but again, I want to keep myself on schedule. These slides are available. I want to give you an idea. These are the strongest prospects for Democratic pickups in the Texas State House. And what you have here is what happened in 2018. And what you see here is 2 important pieces of information. One, the Democratic two-way vote was within a percentage of the Democratic candidate winning. And more importantly, Hillary Clinton was doing as well as either the two-way Democratic State House, or if you look in the 108th, 12th, and 138th by Dwayne Boack, she was winning these Texas House seats. Now, there's not 9 seats here, there are 7, but these are the strongest prospects. I expect that 6 of these seats will probably flip to the Democrats come November. Next set of seats are a little closer. I just should comment here, I did not put Sarah Davis in this list in the 134th. Some of you live in that district. She's further down. I would put her in this top list now. I think her chances against Ann Johnson are diminishing with every day, largely because of something having to do with straight ticket voting and the splits. I think she will suffer the same way Ed Emmett did. A moderate, even centrist, even leaning, moderate Republican Democrats are not likely to vote like they did for her in 2018. The other seats, and I put again Sarah Davis here, Hillary Clinton won her district with 58%. There's no other prospect, no other Republican incumbent won re-election with the kind of vote that Hillary got. I think this is going to be the time when Democrats who've been voting for Sarah Davis say, however good she may be as a representative, she's in the wrong party. And this, of course, is a redistricting year. Some of the other seats are also in what I would call likely but not certain. But between these 3 and the 7 I have above here, we've got 10. And so I give the Democrats probably somewhere between 51 and 54, 55% chance of taking the state house. Should they not take the state house, they will have picked up considerable number of seats. And as we all know, the Speaker of the House is no longer running for re-election, Mr. Bonin from Galveston. And so there'll be a new fight for Speaker. Even if the Republicans are in the majority, the Democrats will have a tremendous amount of influence trying to, so to speak, line up among that Republican candidate who might be willing to make some concessions on redistricting, on committee appointments, and legislative agendas. I'm not going to go through all of these, but let me say here, if I can take a quick break and explain why these districts have changed. The easiest way to see this is in the table that looks at partisan designation by competitiveness. What you begin to see in districts where the Republicans were winning but less than 2%, you begin to see the Democratic registration comes much closer to the Republican registration. And I think this reflects on 2 things that have happened over the last 20 years. And that is simply people have left the electorate and people have entered the electorate. People leave the electorate by dying, moving away. People enter the electorate by moving into our state or coming of age and registering and voting. Normally, Democratic voters don't vote in midterm elections. And in 2018, they surprised everyone, including myself, by voting at rates comparable to the Republicans who turned out in the 2018 election. The big difference was the distance between registration, particularly if you go back to the districts that I mentioned before, and you begin to see that this change in swing districts was due largely to demographic changes over time and a higher rate of registration. The Democrats were destined for this starting in the 80s and 90s when white Republicans first came into majority. They did not have enough children to replace themselves, and the children they had often did not reside back in the state. Republican Democratic voters tended to have a higher number of children in the 80s and 90s who are coming of age now in the mid 21st century. And in 2018, they started voting. I'm going to skip over some of these tables and kind of get to a question here and then talk a little bit about mail-in voting. But how did we get to the state of polarization? What I want to suggest here is very simple. This didn't happen overnight. It's happened over probably the last 25 years. So let's look at the distribution. These are polls conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust. These are not small samples. These are tens of thousands of voters. And voters are identified not only by their self-identification as a Republican or a Democrat, but they're asked a series of questions ranging from affordable health care to foreign policy questions to issues on social questions ranging from abortion to same-sex marriage to tax policy. And what you begin to see in 1994 is what we call a normal distribution. This country was pretty much a centrist country. People who are consistently liberal and consistently conservative were at the extremes. And what you had in the middle was not only a majority, but Democrats and Republicans in the middle overlapped. You had a lot of purple area. This is how you build bipartisan politics. And if you look between 1994 to 2000 and 2014, I hope you can begin to see what I call the hollowing out. Look at that spot there, the hollowing out. The majority pushed to the extremes to where in 2014, and these numbers just got more extreme, I'll show you some more going into 2020, that the Democrats and Republicans were defining themselves to where there wasn't a center. I'd ask this question of my students, but there are too many of you here tonight, so I'll ask it and answer it. When was the last time the distribution of party preferences on an ideological scale was this polarized? You have to go back to the Civil War of 1860, when Southern and Northern Democrats, Republicans were so skewed. And then, yes, on the issue of slavery, but also on the issue of states' rights and the many, many economic policies, including the tariff. This is the point of this table. This didn't happen yesterday. And I might say here, it didn't happen with the election of Donald Trump. My argument is Donald Trump was simply a symptom of this problem. He is not necessarily the cause of it, though he may exacerbate it and he may take advantage of it. This is a problem that has its roots starting back, almost 25 years ago. Republicans shift to the right and Democrats to the left. Same data, but what's most interesting here is what percent of Republicans were consistently conservative in 1994? Two-thirds. But when you get to 2014, it's 92%. That number as of today has risen to 96, 97. And look what the Democrats have done. They've been consistently moving in the opposite direction. So what you see here is simply the consequence of this. There is a separation and a strong separation. The minority is just simply, we're a country that likes to believe that there is bipartisan politics. We'd like to believe that the center rules. And again, look at what the center, mixed conservative liberals on any partisan dimension were almost 50%. In 94, 2004, you could even see in 2008 when President Obama was elected, how he could push through, however difficult it was, something like affordable health care. You've got a 10% drop in the center, so that the majorities now make up the tails of the distribution. That becomes hard, if not impossible, to get legislative enactments. It's why we haven't had a budget for almost 15 years. It's why, for instance, the president, as much as he is trying to get a relief bill or a third relief bill, you can begin to see why Republicans in the Senate are balking at spending close to $3 trillion in a relief bill, fearful of a deficit that they may be responsible for if their president wins re-election. It makes it really hard to do anything. Polarization surges among politically engaged. So these are people who are politically engaged. So what do I mean by that? These are people who vote. What Pew did was look at the voter registration list. And if you think the cavern is big among all voters, look at how much bigger it is among people who vote in not only just presidential, but show up in midterm and in primaries. These are the men and women up here who are picking the candidates to run for office. And you can begin to see that you cannot run a democracy when you have that kind of what we call bifurcation or polarization. So I like to say to my students, there's the electorate. The electorate is those of us who are citizens of voting age and registered. And then there's something called the selectorate. The selectorate are the people that vote. And as you well know, most of us don't vote. What Keith, Mr. Stein, and others are doing, trying to get you to vote, it's not inconsequential. A 53% turnout rate in the 2018 election is not something that will close that gap. Even here, I apologize. Even here, the gap is pronounced. Here, we're talking about turnout rates that barely meet 50%. So you can begin to see that polarization, along with low levels of participation, produce the kind of paralysis you might all perceive as going on, if not in Washington, in other state capitals. Let me talk briefly about the origins of this polarization, because I think it has some relevance. Party affiliation is based on social group affiliation. You acquire some of that from your parents, both through nurturing and through genes. And yes, most people marry people like themselves, first marriages. Party behaves more like a sports fan than a banker. You don't choose your party because it's a good investment. You choose your party because of that social group affiliation. Partisans feel more emotionally connected to the welfare of their party, and they prefer to spend time with other members of their party, and they tend to see their party members not only like them, but more desirable, and they tend to see others outside of their party as not only undesirable, but even threatening. I won't go through all of this, but sorting is matching of an individual's ideological preferences with their social and other group identities. Racial, ethnic, religious, occupational, and class all bring the sorting. So it's not a surprise that people of color are disproportionately Democratic, whites are disproportionately Republicans. You can go down the line on religion, you can go down the line on union memberships. And what these social groups do is reinforce the partisan perceptions to the point where people of one party prefer not to live with people of the other party, prefer not to socialize with people of the other party. This is the politicization of these social identities, and it shows up in things. I'm not going to even go through all of this, but it shows up over time. The sorting, the ideological sorting since 1972 is that strong partisans have gotten stronger, pure independents, not much. In fact, they've declined almost to the point where you don't find many people who they'll tell you they're independents, but when you start looking at their voting patterns, they don't. And the sorting here is that as people have gotten stronger in their partisanship, the parties have separated on social, demographic characteristics, to the point now where wearing a mask, social distancing, and voting on election day is a partisan issue. It is not a health issue. And I think no one better than the president, his chief of staff, his vice president exhibits this. So when you start looking at how the echo chamber works, here are questions that were asked. Is it important to me to live in a place where people or most people share my political views? And what you see is who are most consistently conservative or consistently liberal are most likely to say yes to those questions. Most of my close friends share my political views, conservatives and liberals, everybody in between, a little bit mixed. So you can begin to see if activists are more likely to be strong partisans. Strong partisans are more likely to vote and to participate in politics, and they sort themselves. Where and when and how are they ever going to talk to each other and find any mutual understanding? One of the other gaps that probably explains Texas politics and much of what happened in 2018 is the gap between old and young voters. And you can begin to see what's going on here. This is the gap in partisanship between voters. It wasn't very large starting in 72, and it starts widening in the 2000s. First with the Kerry Bush election, then Obama, McCain, Obama and Romney. It came down a little bit. My suspicions are, again, you're going to see the gap get wider and wider. The gap starting in around 2076 was negligible, single digits, and has simply grown. Younger voters are coming into the electorate slowly. And I use the word younger. Here it's 18 to 29, but my sense of a younger voter is somebody under 45. And when they start voting, usually when they have children, get jobs, buy houses. But when you start getting 18 to 29-year-olds voting, in the 2018 election, 18 to 29-year-olds represented about 27% of registered voters. They only represented 17% of the actual vote. In the 2004 2008, 2012, and the 2016 election. They were consistently voting under their proportion in the electorate. In 2018, they voted at over their share at almost 31%. So what you're beginning to see is an electorate that is getting younger, decidedly less Anglo, and separating for what amounts to be Democrats, progressives, or whatever else word you want to use, from monster to, I think the president called Kamala Harris a communist. The generation gap here shows up on a whole wide range of generational groups, and it gets wider as the electorate gets younger. Maybe this is my last one, and I'll talk a little bit about what's happening with voting here in Texas and in mail-in voting. But this is what we project the world's going to look like in the next census and going forward. This is a country that was largely built on Anglos as citizens in voting, and you can begin to see that the actual versus the projected, it probably will be around 2024, where in Texas, the majority of registered voters is non-Anglo and well under the age of 65. The rate of voters leaving the electorate over 65 runs about 4.5% every 4 years. That's made up with about almost 7.5% to 8% of new voters coming in who are decidedly younger and non-Anglo. Let me just give you some consequences of polarization. As I said, take a policy like walkable communities. Conservatives like more room, and liberals, they really like walkable cities. I mean, you can begin to see why the metroplexes of Texas, even the suburban and even exurban areas, are turning more blue. These are communities that are trying to deal with high levels of density and walkable cities. I'm going to skip over some of this and just give you an idea. So one consequence you might say is, well, the Congress can't get along. This is simply the dark black line are Republicans and the gray line are the Democratic vote. And what you see is the overlap. This is where Democrats and Republicans were voting together. How often did Democrats and Republicans vote on the same issues, on the same roll calls in the Senate in 1973 to 74? There was a healthy overlap. Yeah, most Republicans were on the right and most Democrats on the left, but you had well around a third of both party members voting together. That was in 1973 and 1974. That's what it looked like in 2011 and 2012. There wasn't any overlap. So one of the consequences of what happens in the electorate is that the voters are polarizing. They're polarizing more extremely among those who participate. Those that vote matter, those that don't have a say. They elect this kind of Congress, not this kind of Congress. I'm not going to get into a lot of this. There are remedies for polarization. One of best of the political scientists points out this is nothing new. The 1850s and the 1870s, of course, polarization over sectional, racial, and class orientation. The 1950s, and those of us who are young enough or old enough to remember the Vietnam War, things were bad then. What brings a country together? Acts of Congress, things that cross regions, that cross partisanship. The Northwest Ordinance Act, I know you all remember that. It gave us public education. Land-grant colleges, the Morale Act, 1862 and 1890, first, of course, initiated by President Lincoln, and they created land-grant colleges in the South, in the North, in the West. The Highway Trust Fund, Eisenhower's great contribution. Roadways to connect us so people could what? Travel across states. Now state borders were more than just places or signs that told you were lost. The Clean Water Act, National Science Foundation, even the St. Lawrence Freeway. I would call these, my colleagues would call these pork barrel, but these were things that benefited everyone in the country directly or indirectly and built political will, political coalitions to support the Highway Trust Fund, because everyone was going to have a road, or the National Science Foundation that would fund land grant colleges. There are ways to build coalitions by addressing problems that everybody has, not just the people who live in one region or one part of the country. I'm not going to go through some of this, but let me stop here. And if I'm not going too long, but I'll be happy. Let me just get out of this and ask if I can talk also about what has become a hot topic, mail-in voting, but I want to leave this to Keith and to Claire.
Yeah, Bob, why don't you go ahead and we'll cover some questions kind of at the end, but why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about the state of mail-in voting and any other information you think people need to know about that.
You got it. This is one I don't mean to recycle.
And by the way, somebody specifically asked about the current drop-off ballot box.
Yep, I'm going to touch on all of it. This was a lecture I gave to the Attorney Generals, and you'll note the date. It was April 24th, so this is a while ago. And I'm not altogether certain. I'm not absolutely willing to stand by everything that's in here. I don't think much has changed. So let's get to the issue. We're going to try to make elections. I'm sorry, I got to get to my slideshow. So what's the challenge? It's to prevent and protect voters and poll workers from contracting and spreading the virus. And there are lots of ways we can do this. One, waiting to check in to vote for this in-person voting, checking in to vote, voting, including marking your paper ballot, scanning it and depositing it. The simple fact is in-person voting can be very dangerous in a pandemic. It can be dangerous for voters. It can be even more dangerous for poll workers. In fact, as I said, you can't have elections without poll workers. So how might we solve some of these problems? There's all kinds of solutions, but none of them are single. And what I'm going to argue tonight is that when and where voters cast their ballots on election day or before, it varies across the 50 states. Vote by mail has been touted as a means of lessening this risk, but be careful what you wish for. However many voters are given a chance to vote by mail, many of them will be voting by mail for the first time, and it's problematic for legal, political, and practical reasons. In fact, the solution to this problem is what I think our county clerk, before and current, Chris Hollins, and the administrator, Michael Wynn, and that is to take a multivariate approach to this. Like spreading the virus down, you're going to have to vote by mail, in person early on election day, and let me show you how. How did we vote in the US up until 2018? Most of us voted on election day. Vote by mail looks like a lot, but as I'll show you, it's only very prevalent in a few states, and in-person voting has never really, it's probably about 17 to maybe at the most 20%. That's up to 218. So mail-assisted voting has been argued as a safer, right? You get a ballot in the mail, you fill it out at home, you put it in the mail, you drop it off at a remote drop site. You never come into contact with people, no viral load. Problem, there's no one way in which we vote by mail. There's actually 3 different ways. The most restrictive is our state of Texas. 8 states really limit voting by mail to people over 65, disabled and people out of the jurisdiction, but they're a small share. 36 states have no excuse mail-in voting. You have to request a ballot, and then everything looks just pretty much like excuse only. Yeah, some states allow you to go online and apply for a ballot. Still, states like Texas make you mail in a written form. There are different requirements for filling out the ballot, for returning it, and where you can return it. We'll talk about that in a minute. The most or least restrictive are the 6 states that have universal vote by mail, and they mail you a ballot every election, and you don't have to ask for it. It's like the publisher's sweepstakes. Look at the states that, for instance, have the light blue states here in the middle, no excuse. These brown states, the exception here is New York. They just changed it to
Hey, Bob, can you share your PowerPoint, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry. Somebody should have told me this. I didn't. Okay, is that better?
There we go. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Keith. So look at the states that have excuse only, with the exception of Indiana. New York actually has just changed. These are southern states. South Carolina. Look at the states that have vote by mail, where everybody gets mailed a ballot, Western states. Later on, you might ask me, why did they adopt these rules? But these are the states. 75% of Americans will be able to vote by mail in this election. But what's interesting here is that up until the 2020 election, 7 states averaged about 80% of their votes by mail. The rest of us, 11%. Up until this election, on average, only 8% of Texans voted by mail. What I'm trying to get at here is, if you all of a sudden have a lot of people in the July primary runoff, 35% of people voted by mail. In the November election, a survey that I just completed for the Harris County Clerk suggests that 35 to 42% of people will try to vote by mail. When you vote by mail for the first time, you're much more susceptible to making mistakes. And that's of great concern to us. So vote by mail is not a guarantee of higher turnout. The county clerk has also established, and many other jurisdictions have done this, many more in-person early voting locations. In fact, the number of locations in Harris County is going from 58, and here are some of the advantages. I'll talk about vote by mail. But we can't all vote by mail. The state Supreme Court has ruled that only people over 65 or are otherwise disabled, and that disability does not include fear of the coronavirus. Now, there are all these advantages, but one of the big ones, disadvantages, and I'm going to talk, I'm sorry, I missed is that a lot of ballots never get received. 2008, almost 3 million ballots were mailed to voters that were never returned. 800,000, almost 1 million ballots were rejected in 2008. And this is before a lot of mail-in voting. People don't know where, when, and how to return their mail ballots. And this is a great concern. So what I'm suggesting here is that mail-in balloting may be a safer way to vote. It is not necessarily a safer way to assure that voters do not make mistakes. I personally think that drop-off locations of the sort that the county clerk had encouraged people to drop their ballots off enhances that. But remember, in Texas, to drop off a ballot, a mail ballot, requires you to sign in and prove who you are with your voter ID. So dropping off your mail ballot at a remote drop-off location is not all that much different than voting in person, except that you have fewer locations, or only 11. I would encourage people in our congregation to get your mail ballot, fill it out as soon as you can possibly fill it out, and get it back in the mail. The Postal Service will deliver it within a week to 10 days. I'm confident of that, and I've seen that around the country. The other big problem with mail ballots, they have to be counted by hand and optically scanned. In our state, we're allowed to pre-process mail ballots. Every county can get a ballot and process it as soon as it comes in. But in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the law prevents you from counting a ballot until the morning of election day. Well, if as many mail ballots as we think are going to be coming in, there's every chance that some of those mail ballots will not be counted within the first 24 hours of the election. We might not know Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania until 2, 3, and 4 days. Wisconsin, for instance, is allowing clerks to count ballots received on election day 6 days after. Something I'd be happy to talk about, but remember, mail ballots in most of the states with VBM are walked in personally. People don't want to mail them in. And it has nothing to do with the Postal Service. It's people like to be seen and see other people voting. They get their ballot in the mail, they take their time to fill it out, and then they walk it in. So another example of how voting by mail may be safer, but it may also incur some other problems of late return ballots and an inability to report the results. Let me say one other thing. Mail balloting is not secret. And I know you're looking at me like, well, yeah, but I trust my wife. Well, a lot of voters don't necessarily have spouses or significant others or family members with whom they always agree on how to vote. And there's every reason to think that mail-in voting may be subject to some coercion, something that we have no idea about. Yes, there'll be challenges to remote location mail ballot returns. The Republican Party has sued in several states. Our own governor has claimed that mail ballots dropped off at remote locations or other locations are subject to fraud. Let me make it clear. A U.S. post box is a legitimate mail ballot drop-off. How is that different than a remote location? The Republican Party has a legitimate argument. They can't staff poll watchers at every drop-off location. There are 11 of them. There are 121 early voting locations and 721 election day voting locations. If they can staff poll watchers there, I don't see why they can't staff them at the 11 locations. There is no evidence of mail-in voting ever leading to voter fraud. And let me also point out in an earlier slide, there is no evidence of a partisan difference in voter use of mail-assisted voting. And for those of you who quickly say, but what about people over 65? It's true. And it's also true that there are more Republicans over 65 than Democrats. But once you control for age, there's no difference in the rate of voting by mail, Democrat or Republican. If you think that remote locations are less secure, this is the results of a survey in Colorado in 2014 that my colleague and I did. And you can begin to see that drop-off locations where voters were very confident their ballot would be counted as intended, and slightly more so at the local drop-off than the US mail. Voters who vote by mail and return their ballots by mail are just as satisfied with the system as the people who drop it off. Let me stop here and just show you one other slide, and then I'll tell you, I'll be happy to answer questions. This is the result of a survey that I just completed. And can you all see that one, Keith? My screen's
Yeah.
We can see it, yeah.
These are people who told us how they were going to vote in 2020 and how they voted in 2016. Just so you know, this isn't a small sample. This is a report I'll be happy to share. This was an interview with initially 6,500 voters and another 1,800 who had interviewed in both the first survey in March and April, and again in September. And you can begin to see what COVID's done. It's driven a lot of people who would normally have voted on election day to vote either early or by mail. And it's driven a lot of people who had voted early to want to vote by mail, very few on election day. But what's most interesting and most depressing, and I'm just going to run down here, is how many people correctly knew how to apply for and submit a mail ballot. Almost two-thirds of people did not know how to apply for a mail ballot, and maybe more distressing, and these were people who told us they were qualified and planned to vote by mail or had already applied for a mail ballot. What I most worry about on election day is this problem right here. Submitting your mail ballot could be proved to be very problematic for a lot of people. I know the clerk is working on it, but all the news, all the litigation is causing a lot of confusion. I'm going to stop there because I know I've worn my welcome, and I will be happy.
Thank you so much. That was really a lot of great information. I want to try to see if I can consolidate some of the questions, and if there are more and we have time, certainly happy to entertain more. One of the issues was what is the effect of redistricting that you talked about on that polarization, and specifically, does gerrymandering come into play in that, or is that part of the redistricting process?
Yeah, I mean, gerrymandering is redistricting. It has become. I mean, there was once a time, and I shouldn't be so cynical. There are plenty of states, Arizona, Iowa in particular, who've used nonpartisan boards to do redistricting, and they've done much better. The problem with redistricting is simply that when the party in control wants to maximize their legislative numbers, they will draw boundary lines that are, frankly, favor them. I think one of the problems in Texas, if you're interested, is that when Mr. Strauss from San Antonio was the Speaker of the House, he drew the 2010 boundaries. He and his Republican counterparts, Mr. Dewars, and they just didn't have enough Republican voters to go around. There was a lot of pressure at the time to get as many congressional seats for the 2012 election, where the Republicans 2012 election, where the Democrats were favored. But the problem is sometimes laws like one person, one vote make it hard. But I don't expect that this, particularly with the problems with the census during COVID, the president trying to end the counting and threatening to tell the census not to count non-citizens, which is, of course, the Supreme Court rule is patently illegal. But the count's going to be way down, and urban areas are going to lose out, and urban areas tend to be Democratic. My sense is that depending upon, that's why I mentioned the governors and the 11 state legislatures. They're very important. And that's why the State House of Texas is important. Even if Democrats don't take the House, and they're not likely to necessarily be able to influence the redistricting, even if they did, because the Senate and the governor are Republicans. And if the House and the Senate don't come to an agreement, then redistricting in the state of Texas goes to the redistricting board, which is made up of mostly Republican statewide elected officials. But if you doubt the future is important, redistricting is everything. The Democrats hold the House in large part because the Republicans overreached in the 210 redistricting, but I don't think they'll make that same mistake again. And remember, they control a majority of state houses. So if they control a majority of state houses, they control redistricting. They call redistricting, they can draw boundaries for congressional districts that will be skewed. The polarization only makes that much more competitive.
Great, thank you. And you were going to touch briefly on electoral college, and so if you want to.
Yeah, I won't go through the history of it. You all know, I trust your history lessons. The electoral college is as much a compromise between industrial North and agrarian South. But what we often forget is the 2/5 compromise. That is one of the sadder moments in American history when Southern legislatures were concerned that their populations of African slaves would not count towards their representation in the legislature. The irony of the president's opposition to counting non-citizens in the census for congressional representation actually goes back to that 2/5 compromise. Southerners got each slave to count as 2/5. That's how they equalized or began to equalize their representation, but it wasn't enough. And the bicameral legislature was, of course, the genius of, if maybe not so much a genius of, later President Madison. The problem is, it assumes a two-party system. It assumes a winner take all. And you use the Electoral College to balance out the distribution and concentration of populations in large urban and at the time northern states. The problem, I'm not certain we're any longer a two-party state. I think we're a country, we're a four-party. And most of the world works on a parliamentary or proportional representational system in which states allocate, in Germany, Europe, the vote based on the share of vote you get. Did you notice in that slide, I had Nebraska 2 and Maine 2. There are 2 states in the union that do not allocate their electoral votes on a winner take all, and that is Maine and Nebraska. They give out their electoral votes only on the basis of congressional districts. Now, there aren't many of them in their states, but each congressional district has to be won by a candidate, presidential, in order to get their electoral votes. So you can't have one congressional district outvoting, if you want, another by turnout and driving the whole state. That is something that might be a conversation for the future in the House and Senate, particularly if we elect a president again without the popular vote. Public opinion polls have suggested that voters are beginning to get weary of a president who does not have popular support. And unfortunately, either for President Trump, but I'll be bipartisan and say, unfortunately for the country, this is a president has never been over 50% approval rating. Now, you could say it's his own fault, but I think it also comes about from how he was elected. He was never a popularly elected president. The Electoral College is not going away anytime fast. And yes, I do think the Democrats will look very seriously about adding at least Puerto Rico, if not Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia for statehood, which can be done and does not require, it's not a constitutional amendment. The House and the Senate can do it on their own if the president signs that bill. So if people are worrying about packing of the Supreme Court, I think there's every reason to think that there may be moves to bring in Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia into the 51st and 52nd states.
Great, thank you. One last question before we wrap up. There was some questions about sort of logistics of mail-in votes. Any sort of tips for common mistakes that are seen on mail-in ballots and what people can do to avoid that?
Yeah, I have my mail-in ballot here. Of course, I don't look like I'm over 65. Some think I'm other abled, but let me say two things. One, when you get your ballot, fill it out. I am not encouraging you to be hasty in your decisions, but think of it as a take-home exam. You can look up the names of the judges you've never heard before. You can look up if you live up in the 3rd Commissioner's Court District, but fill it out in a timely way. Two, notice, I hope you can see, mark it clearly. Mark it in pen. Don't make your marks over here. Put it in the box. Three, don't write essays. Don't say, oh, I'd never vote for him. You mark up your ballot without an X, it can be invalidated. Fourth, when you're done, fill it out, put it in the first sleeve, close that sleeve, put it in the official mail ballot, sign it, fill out any information that may have been asked for, put a stamp on it. First class stamp will be sufficient. Don't put any tissues in there or any commentary, and get it as quickly as you can, either to a post office box, or right now, only the NRG Stadium is available to you. Today, the line wasn't very long. Remember, if you return your mail ballot in person, you must have identification, you must be prepared to sign, and you cannot bring in multiple ballots for other people. Now Keith and his wife and his 21-year-old son could be in the car, but they all have to sign in. If you are going to deliver a mail ballot for someone who's unable to deliver it themselves, my strong recommendation is just to put it in the mailbox. Otherwise, you have to get a separate affidavit giving you authority to return that ballot. That's one of the state laws regarding harvesting. But most importantly, get your ballot in early. If all goes well, at 8 o'clock when the polls close, the only votes that will not be reported immediately will be the in-person election day. The mail ballots will have been counted as well as the in-person early. I estimate that could be 65 to 70% of all votes cast in Harris County will be mailed in or in person. We would know our results right away. If you're voting in person early, the clerk has a website that will be up tomorrow. It will tell you the line lengths, the wait times at all 121 locations. My best advice, don't tell anybody this, don't vote tomorrow. Wednesday, 2 o'clock, anywhere north of I-10. Why? I could show you polling results from the 6,000 people. I know where everybody's going to go vote. First week on Monday. Wait till Wednesday, 2 o'clock, Wednesday, the second week or the third week. Remember, the governor's given us 3 weeks, an extra week of early voting. And there'll be masks, fingertips, and good social distancing. My advice, if you can't vote by mail, you're not over 65, in-person early voting will be very safe. I think even election day will be, but it's only 2 days after the hurricane season, and I'm not predicting a hurricane by any means, but why risk it? Do it early. You have 108 hours at 121 locations to vote. If you can't find a time, day, and location, call Bob Stein. I'll find one for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Before I turn this back over to Claire and Carol Sue, I just want to mention a couple of things. I've put a link in the chat to the Harris Votes location of the polling locations, and we'll be live with the wait times. It will you can put in all sorts of information. You can sort by the map. And also, if you have not yet made a plan to vote, please make a plan to vote. Take the pledge. The link is in the chat at Emanu Votes. Take a pledge to vote and make sure that you vote. Get your friends to vote. Get your family to vote. It's very important that all of us, regardless of who we vote for, exercise our right to vote. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Claire and Carol Sue.
Claire, I've tried unmuting you. Carol, you're unmuted.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. It was very informative. Thank you very much. I know we all really enjoyed it. And thank you, Jason, so much for your help. Claire?
Was I muted before? Am I muted now?
Yes.
You're unmuted, Claire. You can go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say how important Emmanuel 100% votes is, and thank Bob for a very interesting presentation. And thank you all for coming to hear it. And be sure to vote and sign the pledge. That's it. And Jason, that's the end.
Thank you, everybody. As was mentioned, the information was in the chat and it's on the front page of our website. There's a nice big Emmanuel Votes image right on the front of our website for you to find the information. So thanks everyone for showing up, and we will catch you later.
Bye.